So as I said, we're going to give a brief overview of what OFAC does. We're going to talk about, just briefly about where the authority comes from for what we do. I'm going to talk about jurisdiction, that is to say, who is covered by our sanctions rules. I'm going to talk about the nature of sanctions programs. I'm going to talk a bit about the designations and specially designated nationals list. We're going to talk about exemptions and licenses, basically in practical terms about how the regulations work, and to talk about enforcement and touch on blocking and rejecting of transactions. So just for the uninitiated, generally speaking, when we talk about sanctions, we're talking about rules, laws, and regulations imposed by the U.S. government that restrict dealings with certain foreign governments, individuals, and entities. So that is, U.S. persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction are restricted from dealing with certain governments and persons, either in whole or in certain respects. So just as a bit of background and some terminology, the U.S. government's sanctions authority rests primarily on two pieces of legislation. The first is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which people call IEPA, if that's how it's spelled, and the Trading with the Enemy Act. On particular sanctions programs also have particular legislative underpinning. Some of the better-known ones might be CISADA, which relates to Iran, and the CDA, the Cuban Democracy Act, also called Libertad Act, which is not on the list, but that's the one that underpins the Cuban asset control regulations that I deal with day to day. These laws are implemented in two primary ways. The first are executive orders, and the second, I'll talk about separately, are regulations. So executive orders, by their terms, are orders issued by the Office of the White House. So these are orders that are published by the White House that issue new prohibitions or modify prohibitions that are within the government's authority under its statutory authority. A typical kind of an executive order would be an order that extends the scope of a list-based program essentially by adding names to the list. So there'll be an executive order that, for example, will cite the statutory authority. It will explain why the administration is doing what it's doing, and then say what it's doing, and then we'll attach a list to the back of some new persons with whom you cannot deal. The second way, and I think probably the more common way that sanctions are implemented, are through the CFR, to the Code of Federal Regulations. So, for example, the Cuba sanctions program, the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, as we call them, are in the CFR at 31 CFR Part 515. The Iran regulations are at Part 560. And if you deal with Cuba or Iran in your business, you should become familiar with those segments of the CFR. So you'll find in those regulations definitions of terms, exemptions, general licenses, guidelines for specific licensing, et cetera, all the things you need to know. So the very important topic, something that can be sometimes simple, sometimes very complicated, is jurisdiction. So that is to say, who's covered by the sanctions rules. So the first part, as it relates to individuals, is usually fairly straightforward. The sanctions rules apply to U.S. citizens, lawful residents, wherever they are located, and any person in the United States, whatever their nationality. So this is, I think, what you would understand as the basic scope of U.S. personal jurisdiction. The sanctions rules also cover entities. So they cover corporations, partnerships, et cetera, incorporated in the United States, and that also primarily do business in the United States. It also covers entities owned and controlled by U.S. persons, so owned and controlled by U.S. individuals and also entities. Now, the very important point here is that the exact margins of who is covered by sanctions program are defined within each individual sanctions program. There are differences, sometimes subtle differences, between the scope of jurisdiction described in the regulations for different programs. So, for example, there are differences between the Cuba program and the Iran program in terms of what entities would be considered U.S. persons based on their ownership. So you should look in the CFR in the relevant areas, and if you have questions, obviously, it can be a complicated area. You can get in touch with us. We can help sort that out. Another important point about jurisdiction is that the sanctions laws can apply based on the transaction itself, not just by who's involved. Right? So a non-U.S. person, for example, a French company, for example, selling something or engaged in a transaction providing a service to Cuba can trigger U.S. sanctions prohibitions if, for example, the transaction involved U.S. ports or U.S. intermediaries or U.S. ports or U.S. facilities or the U.S. financial system. The transaction can come within the scope of the relevant sanctions program. So as Olga mentioned, there are two basic types of sanctions programs. I think it's important to take a minute to understand, what's what. So there are comprehensive programs and list-based programs. The comprehensive programs, for lack of a better, more specific term, you can say these are the embargoes. So, for example, Iran, Cuba, and North Korea now. So that means nothing goes in, nothing comes out unless there is an authorization from ofac or otherwise. Then there are list-based programs, which are lists. These are lists of particular persons, entities, sometimes government ministries that you are prohibited from dealing with. Sometimes, so a list-based program is not necessarily confined to one particular country. They can overlap countries, or they're just not tied to a particular country. So, for example, the narcotics list is not country-based. Sometimes they do overlap. There are lists that relate to Iran, for example, but there's also an embargo in Iran. So I think as Olga, I think very helpfully suggested, you should make sure that you examine the list as well as the country-based programs.